Doctors with disabilities exist in small but measurable numbers. How did they navigate their journey? What were the challenges? What are the benefits to patients and to their peers? What can we learn from their experiences? My name is Lisa Meeks, and I'm thrilled to bring you the Docs with Disabilities podcast. Join me as I interview docs, nurses, psychologists, OTs, PTs, pharmacists, dentists, and the list goes on. I'll also be interviewing the researchers and policymakers that ensure medicine remains an equal opportunity profession. Hi, this is your host, Lisa Meeks. In this episode, we touch upon some sensitive subjects that might be distressing for some listeners and readers. Please be aware that the content includes discussions about death during COVID-19, the loss of parents, and instances of medical injustice towards women of color. Your well-being is our priority. If you think these topics may be triggering or upsetting to you, we encourage you to seek support during the time that you engage with the content, or choose to skip the content overall. Take care of your emotional well-being and prioritize what feels right for you. Now, on to our episode.
Greetings, and welcome back to the Docs with Disabilities podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of hosting Dr. Rhonda Moore, a medical anthropologist and program officer at the NIH. In this episode, Dr. Moore openly shares her experiences grappling with chronic pain, along with her diagnoses of autism and attention deficit disorder, all within the context of the COVID-19 pandemic. She delves into her personal journey, recounting how she turned to theater classes to cultivate confidence, and she discusses how these experiences, coupled with her encounters with chronic pain and disability, have profoundly shaped her professional trajectory. Dr. Moore also sheds light on the intricate challenges faced by Black women in navigating the healthcare system. As our inaugural guest with an autism spectrum disorder diagnosis and a program officer, Dr. Moore's presence amplifies the diverse narratives within the medical and STEM community. The episode kicks off with Dr. Moore introducing herself, setting the stage for a powerful exploration of neurodiversity among professionals in these fields.
I'm Rhonda Moore. I'm a medical anthropologist and program director for the Genetic Counseling Resource for the All of Us Research Program at the National Institutes of Health. I live with chronic pain. I'm also autistic and have a diagnosis of attention deficit disorder. I've been diagnosed for the last 3 years. And so this has been a sort of new journey for me in terms of another type of story that I've been living with chronic pain. I'm really grateful for the opportunity to talk with you today.
So you are actually our first person to be on the show that identifies as autistic. And I was so thrilled that we would have the opportunity to highlight someone working in STEM that identifies as having a disability. You mentioned that you were more recently diagnosed as being on the autism spectrum and with ADHD. Can you tell us about the journey to a diagnosis later in life?
No, certainly. I had had a diagnosis of chronic pain early on in my life, but in terms of knowing that I was autistic, that came much later. I got diagnosed actually at the age of 52 after having symptoms for years, but I didn't really know how to place them. My brother is also autistic. Growing up, he needed a lot more support than obviously I needed. I didn't realize the type of support I needed, and I also spent a lot of time masking my symptoms. My mother was also diagnosed later on in life as autistic with also attention deficit disorder. And so when she passed away, I was struggling with grieving that loss. And then I sought the help of a clinician just for grief management, and also decided that I would seek a diagnosis for autism and attention deficit disorder, since it seemed to run in the family, having a mother and a brother, first degree relatives. And I sought a diagnosis because I was having some trouble managing symptoms. The traditional masks and scripts that I always used weren't working anymore. I sought my diagnosis during COVID. So it was really hard to find a clinician. And so when I found one who worked with adult attention deficit disorder, adult diagnosis, it was just really almost like I got a renewal for my life because I was able to tell a different part of my story. It was nice to find a clinician who could help me to not only manage symptoms, but also someone who could help me to understand this new facet of my identity and not feel shame about my identity. Growing up, my brother felt a lot of shame about being autistic. He was teased, he was bullied. And so I wanted to enter this the same way that I do my chronic pain diagnosis. I'm very open about it. I didn't want to feel shame about it. And I also wanted people to be able to engage this new facet of my identity. So finding a clinician to give me that support was really helpful.
Thank you so much for sharing. And I'm so sorry about the loss of your mother. I lost my mother during COVID as well. And it was very difficult to find comfort when you're already in such a stressful situation. You can't see your friends, you can't hug people. It was a isolating feeling. Also struggling with having that person be a main source of support, and with trying to figure out how to have the emotional response that you want to have, but maybe struggling to do that. I went through anger and grief and just feeling, I think very, very similarly, like, how do I go forward? And then the whole world was really crumbling around us, making it even more difficult. So I want to, if it's okay with you, I just want to ask about that diagnostic process, because people were not seeing patients in person, which I would think would make it really difficult for somebody on the autism spectrum, even more difficult to diagnose, but to understand what's happening. When you went through this process, were you doing this remotely on Zoom?
I did it remotely on Zoom, and I also went to the person's office because she was seeing for this type of diagnosis. It's important to be able to, on Zoom, you can see certain features, obviously, of people's emotions and you can read them, but it's better to do that in person. And so she also made the option for me to see her in person so that I could also get the diagnosis, because it's a huge battery of tests. Or let me rephrase that. 3 years later, it feels like it was a huge battery of tests and that it went on and on and on. And so I found her actually on Psychology Today. I don't work for them. I'm not making an advertisement for them. It was just very hard for me to find a person who was actually seeing patients, whether they were seeing people virtually or otherwise. And then I lucked onto this particular clinician. She was seeing adult patients. She had an opening, and that she was seeing people virtually. And also for a diagnosis, she wanted to see people in person. So, we were in there with our mask on. And then I took my mask off because I had been vaccinated, and just sort of it went from there. But it was very hard because, the first person I would have told about my diagnosis would have been my mother. And I'm also sorry for your loss, too. It is hard. And it was at the time.
Scripts play a vital role in supporting individuals with autism spectrum disorder, ASD, by providing structured verbal or written cues to navigate social interactions and daily routines. These scripts serve as invaluable tools, offering a sense of predictability and clarity, reducing anxiety, and enhancing communication skills, ultimately empowering individuals with ASD to engage more confidently in various aspects of their lives. In this next section, Dr. Meeks and Dr. Moore discuss experiences of developing and using scripts and the intervention needed when scripts fail to remove barriers.
So I want to take you back. You mentioned that, your scripts, and I have to disclose, I worked with individuals on the autism spectrum for years. They are Oh, so near and dear to my heart. I worked with mostly young males in the kind of undergraduate college age, so 18 to 25. So many amazing stories of working with these incredible individuals and their families. And we would develop scripts, right? As a clinician and a support person, I would help them develop scripts to navigate their spaces. And so the minute you said, my scripts weren't working, I was thinking, oh gosh, I can imagine as we move through our learning continuum into our career and then start to advance in our career, there are more and more demands on us that are part of what we might call the unwritten curriculum, more of these social, political landscapes of the office, of the more interpersonal communication that happens with a myriad of different personality types, different types of people from different backgrounds. And it does become harder to script all of that out. But it sounds like you did quite well using these original self mitigating measures to start your educational pathway. Is that true?
I didn't realize that I was using scripts at the time, although obviously in retrospect, you realize that, your whole life is scripted to some degree. So I wanted to do something because I noticed that I was a loner. I didn't look people in the eye, even though I had a forward facing student job. I just wasn't doing very well. So I took theater classes. One, because I felt like there was a part of myself that was waiting to get out, and I didn't know how to convey that to the outside world. Also, as an African American, I felt that if I'm silent about everything, then I won't move anywhere in life. And so I took theater classes as a survival strategy to learn more about myself, but also to learn more about how to project that inner self and create other types of scripts. So that helped me to really do that. And I took communication classes because I realized that was a deficit in my background. So because I grew up with a brother who was very quiet. Our whole family was very quiet. We didn't have that many friends over because my brother was bullied by most of the people in the neighborhood. We were just very isolated growing up. And so I didn't really know how to connect with other people in a way that was going to lead to sort of longer or sustained relationships. And so I took these communication classes and theater classes and decided that was going to be my major because not only did I enjoy it, but it also helped me to envision other types of scripts that I could use and engage in the real world.
Well, first of all, I mean, brava, leaning into the communication and the drama classes. What a great way to address some of the things that can be more difficult for someone that's on the autism spectrum. I think that was a brilliant kind of intervention, if you will, without even knowing, because at that time you didn't know that you were autistic. Brilliant intervention in you and probably continues to help you in most of your roles. So you mentioned that at some point these scripts failed to work. What types of situations did you find yourself in that were more challenging?
I took a job in the federal government. I had been in a role for 8 years at the FDA. And, that the great thing about the FDA is that you get into a habit of routines. So my scripts worked really well there. And, I advanced along in my career there and was enjoying the work. And then there was an opportunity to work in a more medical anthropology related role at the National Institutes of Health. But the job was fast paced. You had to constantly create different types of scripts. And then my mother passed away. I found that the other types of scripts that I could create, that wasn't the problem. It's just new types of interactions. I needed reasonable accommodations. And when I asked for them, they said, well, we can give you minimal reasonable accommodations. If it's outside of our group, we can't support those reasonable accommodations. So what I needed was, I can't meet with people from 9 o'clock in the morning until 6 o'clock at night with no breaks. I can't do that. I need breaks in between meetings. And what I was asking wasn't an obnoxious list of reasonable accommodations. They were just things that would help any individual living without a disability to function better in the workplace, but they couldn't support them. They said because of the nature of the work. And so I found myself without my mother in a situation where I needed support. The realities of the job were not going to give me reasonable accommodations that were supportive. Also, in addition to that, I didn't have a therapist at the time to help me to kind of understand these sort of what was going on with me. And I was stuck at grief. I just wasn't able to move beyond that. And so I felt like, my scripts were a house of cards and they sort of fell to pieces and I didn't know how to pick them up, even though normally I would just pick them up and create a new script. This was a script that I had not encountered. The grief that I felt for the loss of my mother, but also the fact that I wasn't getting reasonable accommodations in the workplace. And the routine was such that it was hard, it was going to be very hard to accommodate what I needed. And so I started to look for another opportunity.
I'm sitting here just tearing up thinking, I feel so much empathy for you. I know what you're going through, and it is an impossible recovery. I feel at times we're going to live in grief, in moments of grief, I would say, moments of joy and moments of grief forever. For those of you who still have your mothers, please, please pick up the phone, call them, hug them. It's a loss like no other. So understandable. Routine, structure, these are the things that help everybody flourish, right? But especially individuals that are on the spectrum and having that kind of those guideposts, if you will. And so that loss coupled with the intense changes under COVID. And honestly, I'm sitting here thinking, and correct me if I'm wrong, but before you may have had some of that in between time because you were meeting people in person. So to get from meeting to meeting, there might have been some naturally built in time, but under COVID conditions, and I struggle with this, I know a lot of us do, it is back to back, your Zoom room to Zoom room to Zoom room. I'm going to just say that's not good for anybody, but you have no time to process, and you're constantly under this kind of sensory stimulation overload of visual content, auditory content.
I'm in agreement with you. It was so hard, and also I didn't see a way out of it. Like I mean, normally I can create a different script, but I was creating scripts just to have one-on-one encounters with client because I was in a program director job, and I could do the work and I was doing the work and actually got, rave reviews, but I was burning out because of that overwhelming sensory overload. And at the same time, I was grieving that sort of loss. And so I was trying to make sense of out of nonsense because I didn't see a way to rebuild those sort of scripts or that sort of structure that had sort of sustained me up until then. And that sort of water cooler conversation that often happens in between meetings. I did some of that in my old jobs, not in quite the same ways that most people do. I just got to meet people in the office, got to know people in the office, but I didn't realize just how supportive that is in terms of sustaining. And under COVID, all of that fell flat too. So I feel like under that time, it was an incredibly difficult time because I was also experiencing autistic burnout and didn't realize that I was experiencing autistic burnout and emotional burnout just because of that the sort of aggregate of losses that had been happening and the lack of reasonable accommodation from meeting to meeting to meeting, which I agree with you is hard on anyone. But when you're trying to struggle and navigate as an autistic person with attention deficit disorder, it's very, very hard to navigate those experiences. And that's why it's important to get the support that you need or try to get the support you need in terms of a good therapist. It really makes all the difference in the world.
So that's a perfect segue into where I want to go, because getting the diagnosis for so many people, it's been described as like having a weight lifted. Did you feel a sense of relief?
I felt a sense of awesomeness. Actually, it was not only relief, but it was a relief, but also I felt supported in a way I had felt weighted down just because I didn't know what was going on with me. So I just assumed that I was the one who was broken. There was something going on, that maybe this experience of grief had just caused me to shatter. And I've always believed that, we are our stories, and somehow that our stories are always fragmented and then they kind of come together in this sort of beautiful, broader narrative. But I couldn't see an end to my story, which normally I could script to some degree. I know that we're always living our stories. But what I found was it was incredibly hard up until that point. And then all of a sudden it was like a new lease on my story. And I had also reached out to individuals in the autistic community who had, either been diagnosed many, many years earlier than I had, or who had been diagnosed as children, who were also women, and reached out to them and developed my own sort of external support groups, just because there were so many things I didn't understand and didn't know about the language of the community. So it was really helpful at that time. So instead of staying sort of more insular, once I got the diagnosis, I reached out. I had been reaching out to other people, but I continued to reach out. Being around individuals from the community who were empowered, who had been speaking out about being autistic, and also about the joys of autism, and also the joys of finding community in a new way at different facets and different points in their lives, was just incredibly empowering. It was empowering to me because, I had spent most of my life, I have very few friends, didn't have a lot of opportunities for friendships living, growing up. And so it was an opportunity to have friendships in a new way at a different point in my life.
You bring up such a good point, and it's one of my pet peeves that individuals have the what I call the media impression of autism, right? This very rote, this is, if you're autistic, you can't communicate, you can't look people in the eye, you can't have conversations, you're going to have a meltdown at some point, you don't want companionship, you're not interested in even sexual relationships or friendships, that they're seen as a burden or extra work. And that has not been my experience. I think that individuals on the autism spectrum are so stereotyped. You've talked about not making eye contact, not having many friends, but I wonder if we just take those two examples that you've given us, the not having much eye contact, we can understand that it's a sensory issue. It's uncomfortable, but that doesn't mean that you don't want to have friends. Would you say that growing up, you wanted and longed for friendship, but maybe didn't have the skills to engage?
My parents were very protective because my brother was being bullied. So they hyper screened anyone who potentially could have been a brother or sister of someone who bullied him. They sort of I think they were hyper protective of my brother. And by default, with what the things that my brother couldn't do, then I couldn't engage in. I think there were other issues in the home. They weren't particularly happy with one another also. So I think that it led them to sort of not support as much of the social engagement. Through the theater classes, I learned to look people in the eye. I just decided that people, at least in American culture, and this is sort of broader, sort of non-Hispanic white culture, tend to, if you don't look someone in the eye, they don't think you're trustworthy, and they don't invest in quite the same way emotionally. Understanding that, I tended to look people in the eye. I don't do it directly for long periods of time. I've sort of learned to compensate to do that, so that people will realize that I'm trustworthy and that I have something to offer that's greater than what they would have previously thought. But I do think there is a lot of stereotypes about the community that is really problematic. When I were first disclosed to people. There were people who were like, well, you don't seem autistic. Clearly you can't be autistic because someone who's autistic is like Rain Man, almost a savant when it comes to math. I said, well, I can barely add, so I'm not really great at math. I'm good at other things, good at pattern making, good at retaining memories of important facts. They're just things that I'm good at, but I'm not good at a stereotype, and no one's good at a stereotype. There are a lot of misconceptions about the community that we still have to fight against, and that we're not broken, that autism isn't something to cure or something to fix. People need supports, they need reasonable accommodations, they need jobs, because most autistic individuals who are adults don't have jobs. So they need not only employment, but also meaningful employment, the things people need that are outside of these sort of stereotypes.
I was on the board of a few organizations that were doing coding and things like that, leaning into some of the perceived or real skill set of this group. But in doing that and creating these opportunities for work, they were also creating a community, an opportunity to socialize, where the way that you socialized or what you wanted to do was now the normative way to socialize and engage, and wound up being such a great resource for so many of our students. And then the community has just grown. I haven't been as involved as when I moved over to medicine, but the community has grown so much, and I am just always so happy to see all of the connections going on, all of the groups, the advocacy.
Engagement between people can vary socially and culturally, by country and region, such as how Dr. Moore discussed the value of eye contact in the U.S. and its implications for autistic individuals. Stereotypes about people and the impact on true connection is powerful. Listen as Dr. Moore and Dr. Meeks describe their experiences engaging with others abroad and the noted differences from the U.S.
We tend to reduce people, don't we? I mean, whether it's by race or your sexual orientation or your job description or your age, we are such a reductionist society. And I don't see this as much outside of the US. You mentioned something about this being very US centric. I would say that it's fascinating to me. I've spent a lot of time in Europe this year. I actually lived there for a little while. And people don't ask you what you do for a living. They don't ask you, kind of the stereotypical questions that we start with in the US, right? We want to categorize you immediately in the US. Who are you? What do you do? How important are you? How do you fit into my schema? And, you go over to France or Italy or anywhere in Europe, and people want to know who you are. Who are you as a person? It's a very different type and style of engagement, and I found it really warm and just different.
I think it's really warm and wonderful in terms of the friendships that I've made. And I'm in agreement with you. I spent some time in Brazil, and I've spent some time in the UK. I did a hospice rotation in the UK, and people were really interested in who you are. What do you like to do? What are some of the things that you would like to engage in? I mean, it was a totally different conversation, and it was refreshing, because in DC, the first thing someone asks you really is what you do for a living, and how you can help them, or how they can connect with you in terms of your work. And it's refreshing that someone wants to know who you are, and what you all might do together as human beings. So that human to human connection is really important. It makes a difference.
I think we've lost getting to know one another, right? Just on this human level. And that connection, whether I identify as autistic or not, that connection is so important to just our development as humans. You connect a lot of people now in your work. Tell us about your role. I love your role.
I currently work with the All of Us research program, and the goal of the program is to recruit 1 million or more people around diverse metrics. So we're representing people from underrepresented communities within the whole framework of the program. Community engagement is a huge part of the program, and also health equity is one of our metrics is across the program. So it's a really beautiful program. It's one of the most ambitious programs because it's in genomics, and so it's NIH's Precision Medicine Initiative. I came to the program. There was a colleague of mine and friend who also worked at the FDA. And when this job opportunity came up, he, I think, recommended me as somebody to talk with. But my current supervisor had already decided that I was someone she wanted to interview. And so the interview process was much easier than a lot of NIH interviews. You know, when a job feels right, everything else flows differently. I didn't ask about reasonable accommodation during the interview process. And so currently what I do is I'm a program director for the genetic counseling resource. The genetic counseling resource is responsible for returning genetic results to participants. We believe participants are our partners. And so we work with individuals as partners, either as participant ambassadors. It's a part of our framework. It's just been a really wonderful component of the program. And as a person who's autistic, when I first came on board, I mentioned during my interviews that I was autistic, and that, you know, part of the reason I wanted to join this program is because of the focus on diversity, the focus on equity, the focus on including participants as partners. And so that was part of the reason that I took this job, is so that I could be part of this wonderful program that's going to make a difference in people's lives, not only people who look like me as an African American, but also people across the United States from all different diverse backgrounds, sexual and gender minorities, people with disabilities, people living in low income situations. And so it was something that was really inspiring for me, that here's this part of NIH that's not only thinking about doing that, but they're actively doing that.
That's amazing. So first of all, we need more representation. So the idea of the All of Us program is needed. We don't, we talk about how we have precision science, but we don't. We are missing so much information. So it's a really important program. Tell us about what happens when someone has a result that maybe carries a little bit more weight or surprise for them.
The genetic counseling resource are the ones who return the results. I'm the program director. So basically, I'm supporting that program, making certain they have funding, certainly making certain that they're meeting sort of designated milestones and deliverables for the program. When someone has a hereditary disease risk positive report, which is the report that, say, for instance, BRCA1 mutation, the genetic counseling resource, the person doesn't go to the Genomics platform. They can't download a report. They have to have support while they're getting this particular result. They'll know that they have a result and that they need to talk with a genetic counselor in order to get the result. And so we're not letting people go into these sort of situations without support. They talk to a genetic counselor, and anyone across the program, even if you get a hereditary disease negative report, you can talk to a genetic counselor. It's just that in terms of downloading your report, you can get the support from the genetic counseling resource. So people aren't getting a positive report with no support. So it makes a total difference in terms of their experience, and that they can ask questions about whether or not they want to, should they share this with their physician or the clinician, or should they share it with family members. And also they can be on the line when they talk to the family members too. The genetic counseling resource is on the line when they do that too. So it's a whole experience of support, so people aren't sort of hung out to dry, and they can come back with as many times as they have questions. They can come back and talk to the genetic counseling resource. And these are accredited genetic counselors, and we have genetic counseling in Spanish as well as English, as well as its medical translation in 200 plus supported languages.
Wow. And, genetic counselors, we don't talk about them enough when we talk about our healthcare workforce, but they're really important, especially when we're talking about disability, because they have a unique responsibility to not perpetuate the stereotypes of specific disabilities. And they are going to be delivering this information to patients who only have what society has told them, right, about any particular kind of disorder and the quality of one's life if you indeed are going to develop this disease or you're going to have this condition. I don't know if your group has done training or awareness or kind of anti-ableist exercises towards the goal of being able to do this work and also not, I guess, feed that fear.
Well, within all of us, there's an EDIA, which is Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, and Accessibility Coordinating Committee. And so the committee is responsible for making certain that across the whole program, that decreasing ableism, enhancing diversity, equity, and inclusion across all programs. And we're currently undergoing training to decrease racism and to enhance our understanding of structural racism, but also methods to decrease structural racism across the whole program. So it's sort of built into the equity, the EDIA coordinating committee is coordinating to make certain that anti-ableism, decreasing structural racism is across all aspects of the program. So we are doing training as well as making certain that across all programs that health equity is sort of a center component of all across all the program.
Throughout history, Black women have faced systemic biases in healthcare, particularly concerning access to pain medication and the misconception that they possess higher pain tolerance. This deeply ingrained stereotype has resulted in inadequate pain management for Black women, contributing to a long-standing disparity in the quality of healthcare they receive. The historical narrative is fraught with instances where Black women's pain has been dismissed or underestimated, leading to prolonged suffering and compromised well-being. Follow along as Dr. Moore describes her journey with chronic pain and her experiences attempting to gain equitable access to appropriate medical care.
I want to go back to another part of your identity. Tell us about living with chronic pain.
I didn't grow up with chronic pain. I noticed that I had pain growing up, but I had extreme joint hypermobility. So I was always injuring myself, but I didn't, read that I had pain because I think part of, as a kid, I just wanted to be outside running, getting injured, doing all these things. And I didn't take it that there was something that potentially was wrong with me until I went to see a rheumatologist. I had a very bad car accident. My car flipped, and I noticed a night and day difference in my life in terms of chronic pain. And I got a diagnosis of fibromyalgia, but I also had a diagnosis of Ehlers-Danlos. And so I have HEDS, hypermobility syndrome. And so I noticed that I just was living with chronic pain after that. So my experience of chronic pain, I had experiences of it, and I was always injuring myself, but I didn't recognize that I was living with a severe sense of chronic pain. But after that car accident, and after that diagnosis, and speaking with a rheumatologist, I got other diagnosis, and I've been diagnosed since I was 28, and I'm now in my mid 50s. And so every day I'm taking medications for chronic pain. And I found that it increased my activism around chronic pain. I wrote my dissertation on chronic pain and the experience of suffering. I also have edited several books on pain and disability because I think it's such an important area. And over 100 million people in the US live with chronic pain. It's an invisible disability. And so every day I have chronic pain, but I say that pain doesn't have me because there's so many other things that I try to focus on. I took a lot of meditation classes just so I could learn to distract myself from the pain that I live with. Do I have bad days? All the time. But do I have great days? I do have great days. So I try to focus more on those days. So I have learned to just sort of distract myself from the pain. But I'm not always successful. In fact, most days I'm not successful. But I try to focus on other aspects. I'm married. So I have that support from my husband, and I've had the support for the last 12 years that I've been with him. Finding out that I was autistic after having chronic pain, I was like, well, at least I know who I am, and I'm learning more and more about who I am. All of these different facets of identity have made me stronger and have made me engage in the world in a different way, and I wouldn't be the person that I am without it.
Yeah. And in many ways, we're both in our mid 50s, and that's an empowering time in your life because on the one hand, I'm going to be honest, you do not care anymore about what anybody else thinks, and you won't allow people to define you. But you also have this privilege of defining who you are, where you're like, okay, I now know I only have so many years left. What am I going to do? What do I want to be? And the power to know that you can, and certainly for you, Rhonda, you've been through kind of this myriad of professions as you've gone through your professional career pathway. You can do anything you want to do. So there's that power in knowing that this isn't bringing me joy anymore. I can do something else. I can accomplish something else.
I'm in agreement with you on that. I do think that there's something that in my 30s I was much more anxious about not only finding a job after doing fellowships and then being in a sort of non-traditional medical career sort of made me go, where do I fit, because didn't necessarily fit into a traditional medical trajectory at the time. And so did I want to go into the government and do public service, which I'd always wanted to do? Did I want to teach at a university? I didn't know which one I wanted to do. So I flipped a coin. I don't recommend doing this, but I flipped a coin at the time. But I was really anxious about getting in the government, getting that really great health insurance, because I knew that that mattered for somebody who was living with chronic pain, and getting that sort of right job and trying to navigate toward that right job. So that really mattered to me. And having the health insurance made all the difference in the world, just in terms of having access to doctors, having access to the right type of subspecialties that I needed. And because I could self-refer to many of these, I felt more empowered and more in control. When you're an African American woman, when it comes to chronic pain, people assume you don't have pain. People also assume that your pain that doesn't matter, and you get dismissed. Really, one of the challenges of living with chronic pain is knowing that there's a whole sort of field out there that denies that you have that pain experience. So I have to say that I was fortunate because I had just had a car accident, after which I got a diagnosis of fibromyalgia, that I was able to get very aggressive and good pain medicine. But before that, when it came to Ehlers-Danlos, I wasn't able to get the type of pain management that I needed throughout my whole life. And I look at it retrospectively. Is it because I was an African American that I couldn't find a doctor who for Ehlers-Danlos, which is a relatively rare disease? So there's that sort of rare disease sort of factor that's part of it. Or did I somehow, was it something that some part of my identity that people were denying in terms of pain? I did have a situation when I had fibroids, was in the hospital, and I had demanded good pain management before. And when I say demanded, had set up a whole kind of pain clinic before to discuss all of my unique pain concerns. And because I know a little bit about pain, I thought that I was seeking pain medications, and abdominal surgery. And I was trying to help them navigate the pain medicines that I knew would not work for my type of pain that I had had, because I've studied my pain for many years. And instead of them recognizing that I was understood my own experience, they thought it was pain seeking when I had just had an abdominal surgery. And so I think that many African American women have that situation where their pain is ignored or that it's not validated. And I don't compare it to you can't compare it to what, say, non-Hispanic white women would experience. because we have such a history in this country of discounting the pain of Black women. In fact, it was discounted so much that the early anesthesiology was founded on doing sort of abdominal surgeries on Black women and other types of surgeries without anesthesia. And so we have a whole field that's created on denying a whole subgroup of having pain. So how do you disperse that? How do you somehow detoxify that sort of history? It's going to take a long time.
You're coming to the space with some medical background and an advanced degree and being able to advocate for yourself, right? I always think about the people who are coming without that advanced degree or those credentials and that knowledge of medicine. It's always shocking to me how dismissive the medical community can be when it comes to pain or things that we can't see, like you said. And I think for many people in the chronic health space, that is so terrifying to them, is just not only being dismissed, but then not even being able to get any help, right? So you're being invalidated and you're not receiving any support for this medical need, which can be really hard. Well, we're coming to the end of our time together. And as we do with every single podcast, we have the interviewee give advice to people that are in the pathway to the profession. And I'm so excited because, like I said, you are the first person that identifies as autistic that is on our show. So thank you again. But also, you are the first person that is a program officer. And so, I think that so many people don't even understand that this is a potential career path to being part of the scientific community and to contributing to medicine. So with that, could you give a little bit of like, why should people go into this work, being a program officer, and then advice for getting there for somebody that has a disability and may be thinking, gosh, this is a great pathway for me. I get to contribute to medicine in a way that I hadn't thought about.
My career, as I mentioned, is a non-traditional medical career. I've been exposed to medicine, obviously, my whole life, but also in terms of my dissertation research, I worked with people and postdocs. I worked at medical schools, whether it was Stanford Medical School or MD Anderson Cancer Center. So I've been sort of immersed in medicine. At the same time, I'm not a physician. I don't treat patients. But what I love about being a program director, and this sort of ties back to sort of what I said earlier. Medicine is a story, and you're hoping to create a story that is much more diverse, that helps people from underrepresented backgrounds and underrepresented communities. So you're hoping to not only diversify genomic medicine, which has historically not been that diverse. Polygenic risk scores are sort of based on representative samples, and the samples aren't representative of the broad diversity of our nation. And so the work that I'm doing now is helping to sort of broaden and level that playing field so that people will have better access to medicines that treat all of us, not just some of us. And so that's exciting. In terms of a non-traditional career or even a traditional career, I think being a program officer is you're able to help people tell a different story and help medicine to transform itself into a much more diverse, equitable, and inclusive and accessible field. NIH has a lot of programs right now, thanks to this current administration, that are focused on equity, diversity, inclusion, and accessibility. And not only doing that for funding opportunities, but also trying to create a much more diverse workforce in the biomedical sciences. And so one track that is I would find do informational interviews. That's been incredibly helpful for me in terms of talking to people from different backgrounds, whether someone had a PhD like myself or whether someone had an MD, talking with them about how their whole career trajectories, because everyone's story matters. It's just trying to find whose story is much more similar to your story so that you can find that sort of in, but also learning more about the environment, whether or not an environment is supportive of accessibility, supportive of reasonable accommodations. I did that through informational interviews, and that was incredibly helpful. Also, talking to people at all levels of the organization. I don't just talk to people who are at my same level. I talk to people whether they work as an administrative specialist or whether they work as the head or director of a unit. I talk to all different people just so that I could learn more about the background, because how someone treats someone who's in at the lower level of the organization is going to be how they'll treat me. Not to be afraid to move if an organization is not as supportive as you need, or if the job is not where you want to be in terms of your spirit. My spirit is really wanting to do work that is expanding accessibility and inclusion and diversity for organizations. And so that's what I chose to make it as my mission within the government. And so I moved around quite a bit just to make certain that I would be able to fulfill what is my life goal. And it's borne great fruit. I spoke a couple months ago at the White House talking about African American communities and autism, and I wouldn't have been able to speak on behalf of myself and on behalf of my current role and the transformational role that it's had in my life if I wasn't at this particular job. So other opportunities will come to you if you're able to move around in the government. And once you're you're able to move around. And being a program officer is being a shepherd of different types of ideas and certain different types of portfolios. Every time you take another job, you're learning a lesson that you can build into that next portfolio.
Dr. Moore's interview serves as a pivotal shift in the podcast, serving as the inaugural guest with autism spectrum disorder. Her participation sparks a crucial dialogue on the unique experiences and challenges faced by individuals on the autism spectrum aspiring to pursue careers in medicine. We extend our gratitude to Dr. Moore for her unwavering openness, dedicated commitment to science, and sage advice for those aspiring to join the biomedical workforce. In our ongoing commitment to fostering neurodiversity in STEM and medicine, we invite individuals with diverse perspectives to share their stories by reaching out to us at docwithpodcast@gmail.com or through our website. This podcast is a production of the Docs with Disabilities initiative and is supported, in part, by the University of Michigan Medical School Department of Family Medicine Disability Initiative, the Stanford Medicine Alliance for Disability Inclusion and Equity, the Ford Foundation, and the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation. The opinions on this podcast do not necessarily reflect those of the hosts, their respective institutions, or the funders. This podcast is released under Creative Commons Attribution, Non-Commercial, Non-Derivative License. This episode was produced by Pranati Mova, Jasmine Lopez, Ari Nethwitz, Jacob Feeman, and Dr. Lisa Meeks.